Is the US education system worth it these days? And I mean the whole system, right? Is it giving us the outcomes we want? Are people more educated today than they were 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, with all the information at our fingertips through the internet and cell phones, all the supercomputer in your pocket? I remember hearing when smartphones started coming out. But are we better off today? Is the education system better today than it was 20 years ago, than it was 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, right? Is the modern schooling system better than the old style one room schoolhouse because there was one teacher for all 12 grades because that's what was available, right? Was that better? Was the material better, right? Maybe the instruction wasn't better, but the material available was better. Was that the case? Or is the schooling system better today than it was decades ago? And I don't think it is. There's a lot of data out there on education outcomes, on how people don't know anything. There's lots of opinion articles on that, on how people are turning to ChatGPT or other AI systems to perform their schoolwork, and teachers are also using it to create their schoolwork. So there's nothing being taught or learned, nothing from either party. And that's certainly a strange position to be looking at. Also been stuff where maybe it's gotten worse since cell phones, because there have been a few school systems where they've just completely removed cell phones from the school day. You have to lock it up somehow. And at the end of the day, you can unlock it and get your phone back. But until the end of the day, you are not going to use your phone while you're on school property. And that does seem, at least from what I've heard and seen from articles, that seems to be working better. So maybe part of it is also just the sheer intrusiveness of technology on the school system. And I remember from my own days in high school and college that there were definitely people who clearly didn't want to be there, and they kind of dragged everybody else down with them. So maybe that's also a concern, right? Is, well, if people don't want to be in the class, why are we keeping them there? In a lot of US states, at least, it is illegal to not be in school if you're under 18. There's a lot of those things. You have to go to school. A school doesn't have to be a specific school, but you do have to be in classes and that sort of thing. And that maybe is causing some of the difficulty. But then again, if they weren't in school, what would they be doing? So that's also a concern there, right? And I know for parents, at least having spoken to some of them, that they do not like when their kids don't have school as a unexpected holiday, and when they still have to go to work, because then it's, nobody's home with the kids, especially if they're younger. So that creates some burden there. But the impression I got from speaking to most of them was that school was basically a gigantic daycare that they felt they weren't paying for. So it was a free daycare in their mind, regardless of whether or not that was true, which it isn't. Everyone in the local area pays for the local school system through property tax. If you aren't paying property tax because you rent, well, you are indirectly paying for it because the building you're renting also has property tax. Maybe you're in a state where that's not the case, in which case it's probably paid for out of some other form of tax that you're paying and just don't realize it. So it's definitely a thing we're paying for. We are definitely one of the higher spend per students in the world, but our education outcomes aren't that great, which is difficult. But also the education time takes up a huge portion of the day, right? For a lot of things, if you don't include after school activities, it's 7 or 8 hours. But that's a huge time block. And then you add on extracurriculars like sports, football, baseball, soccer, swimming, tennis, band, and then any clubs or any other. And it's kind of well, they're doing a lot of work. I mean, they're working harder than many people I know who have jobs. And so they're working especially harder than people who are in college, at least based on what I remember from my days in college. There was definitely a lot more relaxed in college, though the material was harder, but the work itself was actually easier in some ways. It's definitely a difficult thing. I also think some of the current material is no better than stuff from early 1900s. Obviously, there's been new discoveries and new things have happened since then, but some of those exams, you'll see them online occasionally. They'll crop up every now and again, particularly when education comes up on Twitter or even in the news, where you'll see an exam from the 1800s on basic math or basic reading comprehension for like, fifth grade or eighth grade or 12th grade level. And some of that stuff is a lot more complicated and involved than what we teach now. And I know a lot of people have complained that there's no financial classes in high school, there's no budgeting, and we seem to have gotten rid of those. Those would have been under home economics at one point, and those are gone. There's no cooking classes anymore, at least not that I'm aware of in where I am, and I don't really hear about them throughout the US. And that might be a useful thing for people to know is, hey, everybody has got to eat. So why don't we teach them how to cook like a decent meal for themselves? Maybe it's not the best stuff in the world, but it's at least something where they can eat at home and save some money instead of having to go pay for somebody else to prep their food for them and, all that stuff. So it's certainly interesting to me. I kind of get the impression that it's really not worth it, that most of it is not detrimental, but we're not really getting any benefit from it. It's an interesting thought to have is, what would it look like if we didn't have the public education system? Because before the institution of the public education system, as it is today, with the large high schools and middle schools and elementary schools, we still had educated people. And the people who were educated really wanted to be educated. It was very valuable to them. And I think today a lot of people don't view it as valuable. And maybe it's because most of us spend at least 12 years, if not 16 or longer, in the education system, right? It's 12 to get through high school. It's 16 if you add on college. It's perhaps another 4 if you had a PhD, another 2 if you had a master's. So, 18 to 20. It's even longer if you go to med school. So, for the amount of time people spend in education, it certainly doesn't seem to have the outcomes it did in even the 40s or the 50s, where people aren't as educated. And maybe it's just because, well, they have to be there. So maybe people aren't valuing it the way they would otherwise. But it certainly doesn't seem to have the beneficial outcome to people in their daily life. And you can see that just by seeing the videos of people who seem to know nothing when asked basic questions of history or logic or, anything really, math. And obviously those are picked to be the most sensational, of course, but there's enough people in there to do those sensational clips that it is a little concerning. So I do hope we can find a way to make the education system better in terms of outcomes, and better for the students, because that would be the principal point of the education system, is for the students, not for the teachers, not for the parents, but for the students. Anyway, that's all I've got for this week. I will catch you in the next one. Don't forget to like and subscribe.